I'm happy to have follow-up questions too. This is not a topic that one learns in a 10-slide presentation. I did prepare 10 slides, so bear with me here. But if you want to follow up, there's my email. I can also hopefully remember to put it in the chat after I walk through my 10 slides. Just, feel free to email me and let me know you saw this presentation so I don't repeat myself and you have a follow-up question. So yeah, I've been at Cleveland Clinic 20 years. I was at Loyola before. And I always start, let's see if I can advance my slides here. Here we go. I always start with disclosures because I have a long history of working with companies. Best as I can recall, even back my Loyola days, these are all the companies I've worked with. The probably relevant thing here is all the different kinds of relationships I've had with the companies. And I'm happy to talk about structures and sort of how-tos for any of the different relationships. I also have a conflict management plan at the Cleveland Clinic. They refer to me as among the elite group of people as highly conflicted individuals. So I have many conflict of interest management plans. That's what you end up with when you have all these different relationships. So just very briefly, I'm going to walk through the next couple of slides very quickly. To give you a background on what I do, I've developed some animal models for stress urinary incontinence and pelvic organ prolapse, and then we've used these models to test different therapeutics. We have a recent focus on electrical stimulation and publications in that area, and this research has been funded NIH, VA, and corporate-sponsored research. And so, there's basic science in there, and then there's applied research. And moving on to the pelvic organ prolapse, we've developed a mouse model of prolapse, which is more still on the basic science. This has been funded by NIH and private foundations. But maybe, relatively soon, we're sort of getting to the development stage where it could be used to test corporate developed therapeutics. And then I've also developed some of my own intellectual property and my own device work. And this came out of my frustration as an engineer with how urodynamics is done for diagnosing lower urinary tract problems. And I've always wanted to see what I would nickname a Holter monitor for the bladder. And I kept asking people to develop it, asking companies to develop it. Nobody did. So we did. And we have a bunch of engineering publications before we got it into people. And this research has been funded by NIH, VA, DoD, interestingly, and as well as some corporate-sponsored research. And this technology has been licensed, and the company that licensed it, Bright Uro, has developed their own product based on the intellectual property. They call it the Glean urodynamic system, and they got approval from the FDA for regular clinical use in April. So that's a different kind of working with company story, and it'll be interesting to see where that goes now. So I work in two major hospitals, not only Cleveland Clinic, but I also have a lab at our Cleveland VA hospitals, right? I kind of did this on purpose in my career because my career goal is to improve care of patients through my research. So even my basic science research, animal model development is highly translatable, and I can always impart a vision of how it could be used to translate therapeutics, improve diagnostics, whatever, to improve patient care. And I think in some ways that sort of philosophy, that vision helped set me up for working with companies, right? And it may be that through the companies, that is how I'm able to see my vision and improve care for patients. So I purposefully educated myself about patents, regulatory environment, insurance reimbursement considerations, all the different kinds of agreements between basically academic scientist and companies, and the different ways we can work together. And that helps. To be able to talk the same language as them helps. So my career, I did a lot of mathematical modeling, then did 2 postdocs. And then when I considered where I wanted to go next, that's when I came up with the vision. So it was an early faculty stage. So the next couple of slides is where I want to just spend a few minutes. Why collaborate with industry, right? As I mentioned, this may be how I improve care for patients. And I'll tell you, industry moves things along a heck of a lot faster than academics. And I've always said I can't retire till I've improved care for patients. So things have got to move faster than NIH funding. And in terms of, I have graduate students, postdocs, research staff, in terms of keeping them employed. I'm not tenured. I'm on a 1-year contract at both institutions in order to keep myself employed. This funding can bridge between big NIH grants, DoD grants, or supplement them. So, practically, it can be very valuable in those downtimes that we all have. And the application process for companies is so much more efficient than government funding. Depending on who you're working with and how it's set up, there may be informal feedback, email of documents, feedback, edit your documents until you agree on something. Hallelujah. Instead of going through, study sections every time. There may be a more formal application process. It's still more efficient. And it's an interesting and different view of the field. And it's always good to consider different views. And I've met great, interesting people. The downsides to collaborating with industry is they are usually on a very short timeline. And graduate students and postdocs don't often work on a short timeline. And regulatory in an academic environment, if we need to get ICOOC approval or IRB approval, it doesn't work on a short timeline. So I'm always saying, I apologize, it's taking longer than I know you'd like, but I kind of try and set up their expectations in advance now that I know it's sort of a mismatch between the academic environment and what the companies expect. They're also very milestone driven. So I've learned to write those proposals with milestones. It's usually, in my case, we'll do relatively small funding to start with a company. And then if we can meet that milestone, accomplish that goal, then they'll be willing to give us more money and continue the project a little bit further. It's sort of the equivalent of one specific aim at a time, which is okay because the application process is more efficient than NIH. The legal department at one of my institutions, depending, will be the one to negotiate the contract. They do not consult me. You must read the contract, the sponsored research agreement, if that's the relationship, because they'll put things in there that I'm obligated to, that I need to know. For example, we always give the companies at least 30 days advance notice, advance time to read a manuscript or an abstract before we submit it. And the goal there is if there's something patentable in there, they have an opportunity to submit a patent. It's not for them to prevent it from being presented, even if the data is not favorable for their product. But it means we have to write our abstracts on the company projects well in advance of a meeting deadline. You'll need conflict management plans. I mentioned that, and you must disclose the relationships whenever you present. There's a huge variety of different collaborative relationships. Someone asked about intellectual property, right? And so some of these involve intellectual property. The first, if you have intellectual property, if you have something you've invented, maybe you haven't even patented it yet, but you think it could be patentable, you must have a non-disclosure agreement before talking to the company, if that's what you're talking to them about. And likewise, they may want to have a non-disclosure agreement or confidential disclosure agreement with you if they're talking to you about something they've developed. Because I develop these animal models, I do a fair amount of product testing in the animals for company. I have not patented the animal models at all. There's no intellectual property there, but the companies have patents or maybe pending patents on their products. And so they want me to sign a confidential disclosure agreement. This goes through your university legal department, usually. And that's fine. And every conversation we have can be confidential. And then the next step in that sort of an example where I'm testing their product in the animal model is to develop a collaborative research agreement or a sponsored research agreement. And in terms of intellectual property, the way we set those up is very straightforward. What they've patented or have a preliminary patent on is theirs. What's theirs is theirs. What we've patented in advance is ours. And anything developed in the course of the project is joint. Any new intellectual property. Usually, we know what projects are likely to develop intellectual property. And so those are the joint development agreements, and those legally are set up with this joint IP, joint patents in mind. So they have a much longer, those agreements, the legal agreements have a much longer section about the IP and how the IP is going to be managed, and may answer some of those questions about who can follow up, who can use this, like get it as much in advance, all your questions answered in the legal agreements, if you can. These sort of testing their product and our animal models are not really joint development agreements. They've already, if they're interested in developing a drug for stress incontinence, they've already patented the idea. They'd be foolish not to. And then they come to me and want to test it in the animal models. And so for those, we just do sponsored research agreements. We do this, what's yours is yours, what's mine is mine. What we develop in the course of this is joint, but it's really pro forma because we don't really, in those sort of things, we don't really develop new IP. If you're transferring, like sending their drug to me, we need a material transfer agreement. That could be separate. That could be part of the sponsored research agreement, can be embedded in it. If I'm using data that they've collected, then we need a data use agreement. So there's all this legal structure that goes along with it. Another way to sort of bring in money to the lab is to be a collaborator on a company-submitted SBIR, STTR grant through usually NIH, but DoD also has SBIR grants. You could be a subcontractor. You know, again, to test their drug in our animal models, we could together submit an NIH grant, SBIR. They would be the lead, I would be a subcontractor. And I've done some of that. And then the legal agreements they could be separate, but they also are sort of embedded in the NIH agreements if you get funded. Joint development agreements I touched on, that's where the goal is to develop joint intellectual property. And we've done some of that. And then there's also opportunities sometimes to be a consultant or advisory board membership. That doesn't really bring in money to the lab, but it can be useful. It can be kind of a loss leader sort of thing that will get your leg into the company and then later create a collaboration. And we've also done some licensing out of our own intellectual property to companies, which is kind of a whole different animal than bringing in money to the lab. So how to collaborate with industry, how to get something going, you know, let industry know that you're out there and willing to work with them and have some valuable skills that they may be interested in or valuable techniques. Publish, right? Lots of them have read my papers and then email me. Say, hey, you've published, you have these animal models on stress incontinence and prolapse, you know, would you be interested? when we make the agreements, sponsored research agreements, other thing, it is non-negotiable that we will publish the results of the research. The graduate students, the postdocs need to publish. I need to publish. The community needs us to publish. So they cannot stop us from publishing, but the compromise is we will give them, give or take, 30 days notice. And usually the relationship with the key members of the company that I'm working with, they're scientists too, right? They're joint authors often on the paper. They help me write it. They give the background on, say, their drug or their product for the paper. And sometimes we've gotten into disagreements about how to interpret the data, how to write the discussion, but usually we can find wording that works for everyone. So we use that 30 days to kind of do fine tuning and fine editing on the papers. Go to clinical meetings, go to the AUA, walk the exhibit hall. Don't just walk it, talk to people, stop. In order to do that, right, you really need to, if you have your own potentially patentable work that maybe isn't patented yet, you need to know what you can disclose non-confidentially and what you need to wait until you have a confidential disclosure agreement or a non-disclosure agreement, right? So if you're walking the exhibit hall, talking to people at companies, you need to only talk about non-confidential material, right? Because you don't have an agreement with any of them. I walked the exhibit hall at the AUA for years and talked to urodynamic companies and said, hey, you should develop a wireless Holter monitor for the bladder. You know, they don't listen to me. We had to do it ourselves. But it was just an idea. You know, we didn't have enough to patent it at the time. And I just wanted to see it for patients. So, and then, you know, but that conversation leads to another conversation, leads to another conversation. And it's worked out. Get involved in relevant clinical societies. You know, AUA has an amazing office of research, lots of opportunities to get involved, meet clinicians, you meet corporate sponsors that way, learn the different structured relationship possibilities that I've talked about, learn the language of industry partners. So you can talk to them and you can understand their concerns. Right? Their concerns are different than our concerns as academic scientists. Their concerns are marketability, you know, how cheap do you think we can produce it? Like, I don't know, you know, their concerns are what is the market size and who's already in the market, right? These are not things we normally think about. And I don't have to be the expert in that area. But I do have to understand the words and understand what I can comment on and what I'm going to turf to someone else. I turf a lot of those questions to my tech transfer office, and they can help answer those questions. So I'm going to prognosticate a little bit on my last slide here about, you know, what is the future? I think it's good. I think this is a great time to be talking to industry. NIH funding is only getting harder to get, VA funding as well. There's more and more interest in translation of science to the clinic, right? And kind of more and more startups, startups that are spin-offs of the university can have access to the university research facilities. But interestingly, that's actually a small proportion of startup companies. Most startup companies don't have research facilities. Right? They need to work with someone like you or like me. So think about, right, how could your techniques, your skills be useful? Big companies are getting even more risk averse, and they don't want to buy small companies or startups until the data is in. Well, how does the startup or the small company get the data in? To show that their product has potential, they work with you or me, right? And the large companies less and less will license intellectual property directly from academia. Usually academia will license to a startup and then the startup may get bought out by a larger company. And so, you know, working yourself into this sort of chain of translation can be a very productive thing. So my prediction is collaboration with industry is going to be a necessary way to go, not only to sort of, you know, for us to sort of survive difficult government funding times, but also to make things better for patients, right? This has always been the ultimate goal for my research. And as it becomes more common, it will become easier and more standardized, and your legal department will know what to do and be able to help you out. First time I worked with legal department, they were like, "You want to do what?" But now, you know, my legal department, it's routine. They know what we're talking about, and I'll bet yours is as well. And that's all I got.
Thank you very much, Margot. I'm going to put just a couple of observations I made in the chat, and then we're going to go right to Dr. Wood. So we heard from basic science perspective, and now we're going to hear from a medical doctor who's also a clinician scientist and hear his perspective. And then we'll take questions for both Margot and Kyle, and then we'll introduce Dr. Gutierrez after that. So go ahead, Kyle.
Just by way of introduction, I'm Kyle Wood. I'm an associate professor. I'm an endourologist, so I do almost exclusively kidney stone disease. I am a surgeon scientist. I have a lab. I serve as vice chair of research for our Department of Urology at the University of Alabama. I think a lot of what's been said is really quite almost the exact same principles that I'll say. So I started, you know, at UAB in 2016, and similar to Margot, I saw that the landscape was changing on funding, and so I wanted to think about how do you get industry involvement. And one of the primary things I'll say is you think about industry collaboration is think about what you're good at, what your expertise is in your lab or your research, and then make sure there's alignment with whatever group you're working with in the industry partners. There's always a common goal that you'll find. I think the pendulum swung. Like, I think for years, we were saying, oh, stay away from industry. That's not where you want to get funding. But, you know, I think the pendulum's swinging back. I think it's harder and harder to get funding. And as Margot pointed out, a lot of the industry grants are short-lived. So if you're going to survive just on industry grants, that's a really hard thing to do. But if you're using it for the same mission and goals and questions that you're trying to answer, and you find alignment with them, it can bridge your funding. It can get at quick answers to topics that need to be addressed in the field. And that alignment can actually move the field forward. So as Margot said, you have to have all these disclosures. I do a lot of consulting and research. I just believe that it can help move the field forward. And so Novo Nordisk, we've done a lot of work with them. Alnylam, which is an siRNA therapeutic company, we did a lot of the preclinical work. So that was one of our big collaborations with industry, and we have shared intellectual property. Arbor Therapeutics is a CRISPR-Cas company. We do a lot of the shared the preclinical work for them as well. And so we have, similar to Margot, we developed a mouse model to be able to work with them. And so our mouse model is our intellectual property. I've worked with BioMarin on drug development, Chinook, which was eventually bought out by Novartis. We have intellectual property rights through our institution on a drug there. We've done Bridge Bio, and I've done SBIR type grants as well. And then I've sat on too many advisory boards. And I will say it's actually, the advisory boards are quite phenomenal if you can get it to be a part of it, because it really talks to like what industry is trying to answer in the field. And surprisingly, it may direct your research as you move forward, especially if you're not a clinician in a lot of ways, or you don't have clinician collaborators. Sometimes sitting in an advisory board gives you that perspective about, well, maybe I should be taking my research, or maybe my next NIH grants needs to be focused on this, because that's where the direction's going. It's not always perfect, but industry kind of gives you that vision of what questions need to be answered. And if it aligns perfectly with your research, then go at it. Yeah, data use agreements. So I think there's a lot of different collaborations that can be done. And I'll quickly go through some of my publications that have all been collaborations. But the data use agreements, there are things that we're collecting at an institutional level which can serve as good information for industry. As Margot was kind of pointing out, they're trying to answer questions like, what is the market size? How many people suffer from this disease? How many people actually have this subcategory that you're talking about? and maybe even with their drug development. So any information that you're capturing, it's a good opportunity to share that information through appropriate means and data use agreements. And what I will say, you know, when I started this in 2016, I learned a lot of lessons along the way, some good, some bad, right? About intellectual property, innovation centers. So what I would say is early on, get involved with your innovation centers. You don't need to be the one that understands the material transfer agreements, the data use agreements, the, you know, INDs, the CDAs. You don't, what you need is somebody within your institution, and you work with them. Now, they're not perfect either. And so you'll learn through the mistakes that you as a group make. But at the end of the day, that's how you're going to get those collaborations with industries. And so I'll kind of talk a little bit about some of the collaborations. This isn't all inclusive, but I'll kind of talk, it allows for me to talk about different collaborations we've had with industries. As Margot pointed out, there's a ton of challenges. You have your legal teams, you have your institutional bureaucracy. I will say, make sure it aligns with your research. You do not, in my opinion, you do not want to be going off on this tangent. It can occupy a lot of your time and a lot of your lab personnel's time. And they're short-lived grants. And although it may look great, if you end up spending 70% of your lab personnel's time answering this question for industry and it's not in an alignment with your research, you actually get nowhere for you, despite maybe some money that you get in to kind of bridge fund you. And then so that you got to keep in time commitment and what that looks like. You know, Jim, I think Jim, you asked, I think there was two questions that were already asked about intellectual property. Again, it's just early on, knowing and getting your innovation center involved and knowing what is intellectual property. And it is all about the contract, going into it and knowing what's theirs, what's yours, and what's developed. And you just have to have those really upfront conversations early on, especially if you're a site for, say, that preclinical work or their drug development and what that looks like. You have to be extremely careful. And then a lot of that's in the contracting. Are you just delivering results, or are you delivering your thought process, your analysis, your intellectual, you know, what you've developed in the lab? Then it might be different. And so you just have to have those discussions, what that looks like. And that's just early on. So these are just some papers. You know, collaborations don't always have to be like these huge industry collaborations. You can have a concept that you want to answer. So Lisette will talk, but we just collaborated with Novo on 2 recently published papers, but it was a shared mission. We were saying there's not enough knowledge out there in the nephrology and urology world about genetic testing. So how do we spotlight that? How do we deliver that message? How do you get some of the experts together and deliver a concrete message, consensus from us to the community? And industry was able to collaborate with us and supply us with like medical writers, people that could organize us and get us across institutions. So those are relatively easy collaborations that benefit industry and benefit the investigator, because you're publishing on things that are meaningful to the community and getting everybody involved. So these are just 2 publications on that. This was another one where we were working with industry. They were running clinical trials or starting to think about running clinical trials, and we're thinking about urinary oxalate as a endpoint. And they were hitting up against a wall with the FDA saying, well, there's no data about that being an endpoint. That's not going to be something that we're going to approve a drug on. And so that brought us all together. And so if you look at this, the Rare Kidney Stone Consortium and the Kidney Healthy Initiative, we just got a whole bunch of investigators. And actually, a lot of these authors are industry. And we were just saying, how do we align and how do we deliver a message to the FDA that makes sense for our patients and for these individuals that are undergoing clinical trials, so we can advance the field, come up with drug therapies, and do right by the patients, and also do right by the industry partners, but also do right by the clinicians? And can we suggest endpoints? And this was an easy collaboration in a lot of ways because we were all aligned. And so alignment becomes important. This was another publication where we were looking at, on the bottom part, enteric hyperoxaluria. And, you know, a lot of times you'll find industry is light years ahead of where we need to be from a research perspective. We haven't answered the questions that they're trying to answer. We haven't answered it in the research fields. We haven't answered it in academia. And so suddenly they're saying, well, does 24-hour urinary oxalate result in chronic kidney disease? And we're like, we don't know. Like, there's some retrospective data that might suggest it, but we don't have any like really great evidence. Can we go and search that evidence? This was working with Gary Curran on large database, health professional follow-up, nurses' health studies, and saying, can we extract that data from there to answer a very specific question for industry? And again, an alignment of resources and figuring out, can we help industry partners get at some more data that they could use? So that's that bottom one. And then from a very practical standpoint, we have mouse models similar to Margot. We do it in the kidney stone world. We do it in rare stone disease. So then how do we use our expertise in urinary oxalate? And this is not my expertise. These are the PhDs, the John Knight, the Sonia Fargs, the Ross Holmes that we have in our lab. But how do we leverage their expertise to move the field forward? And so this was a collaborative work on the top, was really looking at, can we look at siRNA therapies? Can we deliver it to our primary hyperoxaluria mouse models that we have in our lab, that we have intellectual property? And then can we advance their fields, the industry's fields, but then can we answer very specific questions which are meaningful for us? So here we were looking at the endogenous oxalate pathway. We wanted to understand the metabolic effects, and we wanted to know whether this is a good drug, a potential avenue through therapy, and could this have a meaningful effect on our community? And that was a collaborative work. This one was with Alnylam on the top. And as Margot pointed out, a lot of the people in the industry world, they're scientists. Their brains work like us. And so if you can align yourself with them, those individuals that are scientists, you really, it can be really productive and it can be really phenomenal. And, I'll say in 2016, I'll just quickly say, I sat in Ross Holmes, who was my mentor's office, and I said, oh, we could cure stone disease, idiopathic stone disease, if we went after lactate dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme in that top thing. Boy, was I wrong, right? And it was the last enzyme in the pathway. It made perfect sense to go after it. But then that industry collaboration has resulted in 10 years subsequently us trying to answer questions that arose from that because it was a surprise to us. And so I will say, don't shy away from these industry collaborations, but recognize that you want to make sure you're answering the questions that you want to answer as well. The bottom one was just us we were saying there's not enough information out there. So we worked with the Clinical Kidney Journal, and it was sponsored by industry, but they stayed away from all of it. They sponsored a journal, a special edition, and we just collaborated across Europe and the US to publish. But what a great collaboration with industry. They financed the whole thing. They helped us network across the ocean and really work about bringing groups of people together. So all of this publication in the special journal was a partner in the US and a partner over in Europe, the Middle East or something, where we had two authors, one from the US and one from not, which was kind of cool because you're getting together, you're working on a paper together, it creates that collaborative environment across things. Legal and bureaucracy are insane. I mean, it really is something that can just bog you down. And institutions are there to protect you and to protect your research. And at the same time, it can create a whole bunch of red tape. But I will say I've learned over time that you let the institution do what they do. You let the industry partners do what they do. You focus on that collaboration and that alignment, and you let all the other stuff just work itself out amongst the people that are supposed to be helping you do that. And so I would say it can be daunting, but don't necessarily get involved with it. Over years, similar to Margot, I got really interested in it. So I'm getting my MBA now because I was fascinated by some of this stuff. I think I sat down with the legal team and tried to understand patent rights and stuff like that, because I found as I learned it, it allowed me to have more informed conversations with the industry partners. So if you like it, do it. If you don't, let them do it. And you just focus on the science, and that's fine. Again, I think alignment's the key. Your research has to be aligned with them. And I'll be frank, don't let them push you into they have very specific questions that they often want to answer. And as Margot said, the end goal is you want to publish on this. You want to deliver to the community some information about what you're trying to answer. So focus on the alignment. Make sure that you have rights to publish. Make sure that you're answering questions that are meaningful to you and your research and to the community. And then there's always an opportunity to take what specific question they're asking and give them an answer, but make sure you're adding other stuff that makes sense for the community. And then just time. gosh, I think we all struggle with this, right? We find our days go by really fast, our years go by fast. So make sure that you're committing to the industry collaboration for the right reasons. Make sure it's not going to occupy and you're going to miss out on, say, an NIH grant, or you're going to miss out on moving your field forward. You need to be practical about what you're doing in your lab and your research facility, and you need to be practical about the finances and running a lab, right? But just make sure that the time that you're committing to this is well spent time. And that, I think, goes back to alignment. Yeah, intellectual property, somebody asked that question. It's just early on trying to understand what is yours, what is theirs, and what gets developed and how that works out. And I think that spans the spectrum. I will say, just from a purely practical, the most lucrative thing that I ever created in our lab was the mouse model. It's insane to think that we have drug patents, we have other patents, and the most lucrative thing for me and my co-developers was the mouse model. That's absolutely crazy to me, because we have had drugs that have gone into phase 1 clinical trials and have hit milestone payments. And part of that is understand your institutional structure. It's not about the money. It's about protecting your intellectual property and your rights and your brain trust that you have in your lab. But just, it is insane as you go through this. And you got to remember, some things are just not patentable. And so just understanding basic patent laws makes sense. Because if you're going into it and you're arguing over something that's just never going to be patentable. And I've always said to my group, a half a loaf of bread is better than no bread at all. Sometimes you just have to give up a little bit of ownership when it makes sense to move the field forward. Because if you hold on so tight and you're not willing to develop something because you're so dead set on it, it goes nowhere. Partnership, whether it's industry or other labs or whatever, is what drives the field forward. And sometimes you just have to be willing to move forward and just think about how you get to move forward and how that partnership works. So I'll let Dr. Pennison take over from there.